Do you want to learn to level up your fantasy adventure themes? If so, then stick around because in this video, we're going to journey deep into the Lost Woods to discover the musical magic behind Saria's song from the classic video game, The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time. Let's get into the video.
Hey! Listen!
Hey everyone, it's Rex Mays from the Mays Music Academy, where I put out instructional videos on music theory, composition, and digital audio production to help musicians just like you level up your music making. Now, when it comes to video game music, the Legend of Zelda series has always been one of my favorites, not only because it has some of the best video game music that's ever been written, but also because the game designers have found all these creative ways to incorporate the music directly into the gameplay. And the Ocarina of Time is sort of the epitome of this. As the title suggests, the instrument, the Ocarina of Time, is actually used by the main character Link throughout the game. And the specific tune we're going to look at, the Lost Woods theme or Saria's song, is a good example of how a tune from the soundtrack is incorporated directly into the gameplay, and also the character development of the character of Link and his friend Saria in the game. Now, I should mention that the music to the Ocarina of Time, and in fact most of the Legend of Zelda series, was composed by legendary video game composer Koji Kondo, who worked with Nintendo not only on The Legend of Zelda, but also on the Super Mario Bros. Franchise. So as you probably already know, the music from those two series alone are some of the most iconic tunes out of all of video game history. There's tunes that actually transcend beyond the video game. Most people, even if they've never played those games, have heard those pieces that he's written and recognize them when they hear them. I absolutely love studying Koji Kondo's music because he is a master of composing very concise but very memorable themes that, even though they're very simple, they tell a lot about the character and a lot about the story that's going on when you hear that music. So let me give you a little background on what's going on with the story and the characters at the point in the game where you hear the music we're going to analyze today. So Link, as you may know already, is the main character, the player character in the Ocarina of Time. And you start the game in this place called Kokiri Village, which is sort of the small village in this sort of magical fantasy woodland area. And the Kokiri are these people who remain as children for all the time, and each one has a fairy kind of guide that is sort of their companion through life. And so there's sort of this whimsical, childlike vibe, this sort of Peter Pan, Never Never Land kind of feeling with the beginning of the game. And that's actually where you hear this song for the first time, because Saria, the title character of the song, is actually one of the Kokiri, and she's actually Link's best friend at the beginning of the game. And she's sort of a guide character, kind of helps you through the early stages of the game, and she actually gives you your first ocarina as you leave to go outside of Kokiri Village for the first time. So you first hear Saria's song at that point that she gives Link his first ocarina, and she also at that time teaches him her song, which is extremely simple. It's only really just 3 notes repeated, and it sounds like this. And again, it's extremely simple and just gets that theme started. So the theme gets fleshed out much later in the game when you have to return to Kokiri Village as an adult, and you have to get to the Forest Temple, which to get there you have to go through this place called the Lost Woods, which, as it kind of suggests, it's a kind of a dark, mysterious forest, and you can get lost in it. And the way the gameplay works is you actually have to listen to the music and follow it through all this sort of maze to get to the Forest Temple. And that's just kind of a cool way that the music actually integrates into the gameplay. So let's talk about the sound of Saria's song and the Lost Woods theme. So obviously the Saria song version is extremely simple. It's just the ocarina playing the main melody. But then the Lost Woods theme is a little kind of forest orchestra, and it has all these little kind of quirky, fun little sounds. And of course, the N64 game console didn't have samples, so all the sounds were actually synthesized sounds that resemble acoustic instruments. So they still had the main ocarina sound, which sounded kind of like a flute sound. Some of the other melodies, the That part of the melody, it kind of has an oboe or an English horn kind of flavor. You have this kind of, the boom chunks are played in kind of a plucky banjo, maybe kind of a pizzicato strings flavor. And then you kind of have the sort of bass sound, kind of like a string bass kind of flavor. And all of that sort of comes together to create this real bouncy, just very, you kind of get that childlike flavor, but it also kind of has this woodland vibe with the flutes and the kind of reedy, double reed instruments and just those simple string sounds. So another aspect of the sound of the Lost Woods theme that you should pay attention to besides just the instruments is actually the style that those instruments play. And as I mentioned, it's a very bouncy kind of tune, and that's because it uses a lot of staccato notes, which are short notes that sound like this. You kind of hit the note and bounce right off, and then it blends those with the slurs where you actually go smoothly from one note to another, and then kind of blends those with the staccatos to create these fun little phrases. So you have this sort of, so it's that kind of blend of the slurred notes and the staccato notes, the longs and the shorts, that just give it that bouncy kind of whimsical feel. The last thing I want to talk about with the sound of this theme is the way that the accompaniment is arranged. And it's in a very characteristic boom chunk kind of pattern where you have sort of a bass and then sort of a chord. Boom chunk, boom chunk, boom chunk is where that kind of comes from. And it sounds kind of like this. And you kind of hear that kind of style throughout the entire piece in different ways. And what that does, again, is it creates that very bouncy pattern. It's a very folk-like kind of sound. Again, kind of grounds it into this sort of forest fantasy kind of storyline that we're experiencing in the game at this moment. The harmony of the Lost Woods theme is really simple, but it's also super interesting because it doesn't use your basic major or minor key. It actually uses Lydian mode, which is built off the 4th scale degree of the major scale. And it's actually the brightest of all the modes of the major scale. And it sounds a little bit like this when you play the triads. And you can hear it kind of has a major kind of flavor, but it's that the trademark is that second chord, which is actually a major chord. Normally you would expect it to be minor, but it's actually, again, major. Has that brightness and that lift. So the harmonies beneath the first part of the theme are very simple. It's an F Lydian. It goes back and forth between an F major triad and a C major triad, which is the tonic 1 chord and the dominant 5 chord. And it just goes back and forth between those two simple chords as the melody plays over top of that. So an interesting little detail about that 5 chord, that C major chord, is that it's used in multiple inversions. So you get the root position with the C in the bass, but then you also get the first inversion, which has the E in the bass, which when you use that in that boom chunk pattern we talked about earlier, it just kind of enhances the bouncy flavor of that accompaniment. So it sounds a little bit like this. So again, it just kind of gives it a little bit more bounce in the bass line there. So when we get into the second part of the theme, it sounds like this. We start this 4-chord looping progression that repeats a few times. And that progression is D minor, G major, C major, A minor. And that's a pretty typical chord progression. You've probably heard it before. Now, if we try to analyze that chord progression in F Lydian mode, it's a little bit odd. We have a minor 6 chord, which is the submedian, to a major 2 chord, which is the supertonic, to that dominant 5 chord, and then we go to the minor 3 chord, which is the median, and there's no F major chord in there. The tonic chord isn't part of that, and it doesn't really lead to that F major chord, that tonic. So it's probably more likely that the key kind of modulated somewhere different from F Lydian for the second part of the melody. So it probably makes a little bit more sense to analyze this section of the piece in A natural minor or A Aeolian mode. It still has a modal flavor. It doesn't have that traditional dominant 7 minor sound there. And it's just all white keys starting on A. Just kind of your normal natural minor sound. Now if we analyze the chords, it makes a lot more sense because we're using the tonic triad, which is the A minor, but we also hit some of the other key players like the subdominant, which is the D minor that starts this 4-chord loop. So if we reanalyze this chord progression in A Aeolian, it makes a little bit more sense. So we start on the minor subdominant 4 chord, then we go to the flat major 7 chord, then we go to the major 3 chord, which is the median triad, and then finally to that tonic chord, that A minor, to kind of finish off that loop. And it just keeps going around and around, kind of riffing off the subdominant, the 4 chord, and the 1 chord, the tonic. And that's very typical of a lot of different chord progressions. So I want to reiterate that we're definitely not in a normal A minor key here. And that's because we're not using the raised leading tone, which would be in harmonic minor. Has that very sharp upward motion, which would build the E7 to A minor tonic triad. We definitely don't have that sound. We have more of the subtonic, which is the lowered 7th scale degree, which is the G natural, which sounds very much a more rolling, kind of folksy, almost medieval kind of sound, which is perfect for this theme, which has that fantasy flavor, and there's kind of a medieval theme to the Legend of Zelda games. So when we get to the third and final part of the theme that sounds like this, we actually start to feel like we're modulating again. And that's because it starts on the D minor triad, and then goes to a C chord, but it's actually a C major 7. So that's a C major triad with a B natural at the top. And that B natural starts to allude that we're going back to F Lydian, because that B natural is the raised 4th scale degree in Lydian, and that raised 4th scale degree is what makes Lydian sound so bright. So it really alludes strongly that we're going back to F Lydian like in the beginning of the piece. Now, just when we think we're going to modulate back to F Lydian, the accompaniment sort of drops away for just a moment, and you get this weird parallel 4th motive that sounds like this. And that kind of has a stoic, castle-y kind of theme, like the Hyrule Castle theme from one of the earlier Zelda games, kind of out of character for the rest of this piece. So that perfect 4th motive sort of resets our brains harmonically, and so when we land on this E suspended chord, it's very surprising, but our ears definitely want it to resolve to an E major, which is actually the 5 chord, the dominant chord in the key of A minor. So at the very end there, we lose that modal flavor and go to more of a harmonic minor flavor. But the funny thing, the irony, is that we just go right back to the beginning of the piece, back to that F Lydian. So we go from the E suspended to E major, and then we just go back. So it kind of mixes those modes and those minor keys kind of flavors together. Now, one thing that I think is really cool about that progression from E suspended to E major, and then it goes up a half step to F, which is that kind of lift, that kind of brightness, which kind of aligns well with that brightness of the Lydian mode. So when it comes to the melody of Saria's song and the Lost Woods theme, there's lots of little details that are really interesting to look at. And the first thing is that the main 3 notes that start the melody, that's very unusual, because that F, A to the B, the F and the B is what's called a tritone, which is 6 half steps. And that's a very dissonant sound, as you can hear. It's the sound of a siren. And so the main melody actually has that dissonance, but it highlights that we're in F Lydian, because again, normally we would have a B flat, but we're going to that B natural, which gives it that very bright kind of sound. So that tritone in Saria's song is much more significant than it might first appear, and that's because this part of the story, Link is about to leave Kokiri Village for the first time, and leaving Saria for the first time to go out on this big adventure, and it's this kind of bittersweet moment between these 2 friends right before he leaves Kokiri Forest for the first time. And so that dissonance, that tritone, really highlights this sort of bittersweet emotion that's going on between these 2 characters. So the first part of the melody is very sprightly. It has these kind of surprise leaps and falls that kind of show up out of nowhere. You get things that sound like this, and then the fall back down. But really it just kind of goes up and then back down. It kind of hovers around that tonic. It doesn't have a lot of movement to it. Now, in contrast, the second part of the melody is very directional, because it's always trying to ascend. So the first part of it starts on a D, gets all the way up to the C, and then falls back down to the E and resets, and then it goes up to the F, and then all the way up to the high G, and then we go back down to the D, and kind of pulls it back down to the E again. So it wants to keep going up, and it gets to that high G, and then it gets brought back down to the E. So we don't really get the resolution to that repeating ascending contour until the third and final part of the melody, which has a skipping kind of contour, which just anticipates this buildup of tension up to this high note. So it starts on the low D, skips all the way up to that final E, which is where it kind of lands again with the E major chord in the harmony. Rhythmically, the Lost Woods theme is pretty straightforward, but there's a few little interesting details to point out. First being that the piece is not in your normal 4/4 common time, 4 beats per measure. It's actually in 2/4, which only has 2 beats per measure. And that those shorter measures kind of give you a faster every downbeat every 2 beats, which again just adds to that little sprightly nature, just a little bit of a small detail there in the meter. So the rhythms of the melodies throughout the tune kind of follow the same pattern throughout, which is kind of starting on a very simple on the beat, eighth note and quarter note pattern, but then each phrase ends with this sort of offbeat held note that's on the second beat, which is the weaker beat, and it just kind of anticipates the next phrase and keeps you rolling forward. So if we count out the first melody, you can kind of see how it works. So it's just 1 and 2, 1 and 2, 1 and 2, and 1, 2 and 1 and 2, held on the 2, and 1 and 2, hold on the second again. Same thing when we get to the second part. 1 and 2, 1 and 2, 1 and 2, held on the 2. 1 and 2, 1 and 2, 1 and 2. And again, you're just kind of waiting for that downbeat to come back. So we start with that same rhythmic flavor when we get to the final melody with that skipping pattern, the 1 and 2 and 1 and 2 and 1 and 2 and 1 and then we get to that weird perfect fourth motive, which kind of jumbles up the whole thing. So that perfect fourth motive is the first time we hear anything faster than an eighth note. In this case, it's a 16th note pattern with a little bit of syncopation in there, and it just drives that much harder into that E suspended, which eventually resolves to the E major. So it's just a cool way to kind of highlight and emphasize that very last final climactic note at the end of the melody. So the rhythm of the accompaniment is pretty cool. It's straightforward. It's all mostly just eighth notes, but the way it uses the booms and the chunks in different places helps create a little bit of syncopation, which gives it that sprightly kind of flavor. A good example would be where we have the 1 and 2 and 1 and 2 and 1 and 2 and you get where those booms land on offbeats, the ands, the upbeats. You just get a little bit more of that bouncy flavor. So when we get to that middle section, the accompaniment snaps back to a very straightforward eighth note boom chunk pattern. It just has a 1 and 2 and 1 and 2 and 1 and 2 and 1 and 2 and it just sets up this very regular pattern in the rhythm. So all that rhythmic regularity in the middle section helps set us up for kind of a surprise when we get to the third section, which starts to pull out some of those eighth notes to kind of create tension that leads us to the end of the phrase there. So instead of just the 1 and 2 and 1 and 2 and, we get something that sounds like 1 and 2, 1 and 2, and it's just having those gaps creates a little bit more tension. So when we finally get to that surprise E suspended chord, we actually get this really cool syncopated rhythm in the accompaniment that helps kind of highlight the need to want to resolve that E suspended to an E major. So you get this 1 and 1 and 1 and 2 and 1, and it just highlights it even that much more. We can actually look at the form in the Lost Woods theme in a couple different ways. The first being just within the context of the theme itself musically, but then also within the context of how it's used in the entire story of the game. So if we start within the context of the theme itself, as I've already alluded, we really have 3 main sections here. So section A is actually the simple Saria's theme, and then that ascending pattern is section B, and the final climactic rise is section C. So that 3-part structure it's interesting because each section has its own little character and keeps you interested, and that's very important because the danger of a very short, concise little theme like this is that it can get boring as it loops over and over again. But because we have these different little characters within each section, it keeps the listener engaged and keeps them from getting bored when they hear that tune over and over and over again. Now, as I mentioned, section A kind of has more of a melodic feel, kind of sets you up for that sprightly nature. Again, it's Saria's song, so it's kind of tied to her character. And then the middle section creates that rolling, kind of that looping pattern, which gives us a little bit of regularity there. And then the final section has that direction and lands on that final climactic E major chord and gives us kind of a little mini climax in the piece. So now when we analyze the form of Saria's song and the Lost Woods theme within the context of the entire video game, we start to see how the music actually enhances the character development of Link within the story. If you recall, Saria's song is one of the first themes that we hear early in the video game, and it not only represents Link's relationship with Saria herself, but also this relationship with his upbringing in Kokiri Village, which is a much simpler lifestyle, which stands in stark contrast to these huge adventures that he's going on throughout the rest of the game. So as I mentioned, Link returns back to Kokiri Forest later in the game as an adult when he's searching for the Forest Temple. To get to the Forest Temple, he has to travel through the maze-like Lost Woods, and the gameplay in that part of the story is that you actually have to listen to the Lost Woods theme, which incorporates Saria's song, and it helps you choose the right path to get through this maze until you finally get to the Forest Temple. So that's actually really significant because when you finally get to the Forest Temple, you learn that Saria is actually the sage of that temple. And it's this cool kind of bookend to the beginning of the game when you parted ways and you learned the theme in the first place. And then you follow that theme back through this lost woods and finally get back to Saria. So it's kind of this heartfelt moment where these friends are reunited. And again, the music enhances the emotion and the impact of the story in that section of the video game. And that's just one really great example of how you can use the formal structure of your music to enhance the character development and the narrative of the video game. As a recap, I just want to reiterate how important it is in your development as a composer to take time to listen to and analyze musical themes like this so that you can start to fill out your toolbox of compositional and music theory techniques that you can add to your own themes, especially if you're interested in composing music for video games, especially fantasy themed or adventure games like The Legend of Zelda. So my question for you is, are there other video game themes you'd like me to analyze? Maybe some other Legend of Zelda themes you'd like me to check out? There's dozens and dozens of them and they're all really great. So let me know what you think in the comments below. If you got good value out of this video, I'd appreciate it if you smash that like button and consider subscribing and clicking the little bell icon so that you get notified every time I release new content just like this. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.
Hey! Listen!